We're on. Hello, everybody. No music because we're in the 9 days. That's why there's no music during the countdown. Let me just turn that off. Do not disturb. But it's great to be with you and learning on a Sunday. We got a really interesting page. Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Who is with us on a Sunday night? Tom says it's weird without the music. It's weird without the music. That's good. We should notice that there's no music now. These 9 days, it's not just that so we don't shave, we don't wear freshly laundered clothing, we don't eat meat or wine except when it's Shabbos. But the idea is that we're remembering that there's an absence in our midst. We don't have the holy temple. We just have a model. It's nice to have a model, but we wish we had the temple. Because it's not just the absence of the temple, it's the absence of the ability to fulfill all the commandments that require that there be a temple in our midst. That proximity of God dwelling in our midst, the constant miracles of the temple, all these things have been gone for a long time, and we need to feel that absence. So, you know, the little gesture of not having music during our opening 2-minute countdown helps us to feel that absence so much the better. Who's with us on a Sunday? Paul in Chicago, Nancy in North Carolina, Yehud in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey. And thank you for the reminder at the end of yesterday's show, Sharon. So we're in the 9 days. Next Saturday is actually Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, when we observe the major fast, right? Like Yom Kippur, a full 25-hour fast. But it falls on Shabbos, and we don't fast on Shabbos unless it's Yom Kippur. So next week, our fast begins Motzi Shabbos, after Shabbos ends Saturday night, and then we'll break that fast on Sunday night. During Tisha B'Av, and we're observing it on the 10th of Av because because we don't have that fast on Shabbos. So when we're observing Tisha B'Av, we don't study Torah. We read Lamentations and other practices, but we don't, indulge ourselves in the joy of Torah study. So I think what we'll do is next Saturday night, we won't have a show because we'll be in the fast of Tisha B'Av. And then Sunday night, we're still in the fast of Tisha B'Av, so we won't have a show then either. What we'll do is we'll have our last show during the 9 days on Friday as we're getting ready for Shabbos, and then we'll break until Monday. And what I'll try to do is do a double daf on Friday and a double daf on Monday, and then we'll be caught up and on schedule. So that'll be the plan for next week, for next weekend. So, where were we? John in Maine, James in Indianapolis, Bill in mid-Missouri, Christina in Texas, Melissa in Great Neck, Stephen in New Hampshire, Tom says Shavua Tov, a good week to everybody. Paul in the Great Northwest, Bell in Florida, Shandor in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Gisette in Colorado, Paul says Shavua Tov, Joyce with us from Philadelphia. Paula says at the Sunset Temple, a flute was played. Is this because the sun had not yet set? Maybe I'm not familiar with that shul, and not everybody sort of in the non-Orthodox world is going to observe this practice. Joyce, for some reason I always think of food during your videos. Me too. I'm hungry, it's dinner time. And Norma in South Texas. Over there on the YouTube side, Gwen checking in from Michigan, and Faith in Oregon. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Jeannie Schechter for the healing of Michael. And she has sponsored a couple of shows for that same, for the healing of Michael. And she's reporting that his surgery went well and now is beginning treatment. And the prognosis is very good. Thank God. We should only hear good news about Michael. May he have a refuah shlema, a complete healing of body, mind, spirit in all his ways. And Jeannie, may you and Michael both be blessed in all your ways, you and all your loved ones. Thank you for sponsoring today's episode of AT Daily and enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Okay, our daf, Chaf Hey, page 25, here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. Generally, the laws of marriage contracts. Here we're in chapter 2, continuing our discussion of the 6th Mishna. And as we've seen, so much of what we're learning lately goes beyond the law of marriage contracts to the laws of who is credible, who is believed. By what kind of testimony can we establish a presumptive status, not only for a woman that she is single or that she's divorced or that she was taken captive but remained pure, but also that a loan was established for a person, or just lately in this 6th Mishnah, that a man is a Kohen, right? So a Kohen, these are the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother, and in them God vested the priesthood, right? The kahuna. When you say the big kahuna, you're actually talking about a Hebrew word. The kahuna means the priesthood, invested in the sons of Aaron. So only the descendants of Aaron can serve in the temple when the temple is standing in our midst. Only they can bring the sacred offerings. What does it mean to be a priest, aside from the obligations of serving in the temple? They have the privilege of eating teruma, receiving teruma, consecrated food from the rest of Israel, and eating it. Only they have the privilege and also the obligation to eat the priestly portions of certain offerings which are brought on the altar. So as opposed to an olah, an elevation offering, which is entirely consumed on the altar, the chatas, the sin offering, part of it goes up on the altar and part of it is given to the priests to eat. But you have to be a priest and you have to be established as a priest. They also have the obligation and privilege of blessing the congregation, and that's something we still do today. They also get the first aliyah when the Torah is read publicly in synagogue on Monday and Thursday mornings, and on Shabbat when we do the full reading of the week's Torah portion. If there's a Kohen in the house, then he is called first, followed by a Levite, and then other members of the congregation. If there is no Kohen, then we would call somebody else first. Okay, so here we're establishing, especially in ancient times and when the temple is standing, and so that the Kohanim, the Kohens, they would receive, these benefits, not just the honor of blessing the congregation and being called first to the Torah, but receiving the material benefit of teruma. So who is believed when he says, hey, I'm a Kohen? So just because he says he's a Kohen, do we give him the privileges and hold him up to the obligations of the kahuna or not? So we continue on page 25a, and the Gemara asks, and what then is the meaning of great is the legal authority of presumptive status? Now, this question came up as we were examining who is believed to say he's a Kohen, and when do we have uncertainty about it? And we looked in the book of Ezra. So after the first temple was destroyed, the children of Israel were exiled to Babylonia. And after 70 years, some of the Jewish community returned to Israel and got busy building and eventually constructed the second temple and resumed bringing the sacrificial offerings on the altar in the temple. So, but during that 70-year period, some of these priestly families forgot who they were, or, had children who were disconnected, and it became a little bit muddled. And so we see that there were some families that were eating teruma by rabbinic law while the people were in Babylonia, but somehow their presumptive status of the kahuna wasn't strong enough that when they returned to Israel, that they would be allowed to eat of the Holy of Holies, right? To eat the portions of sacrificial offerings that are eaten by the priest. It's like they were recognized as priests to a certain extent, but because there was some uncertainty, they could eat teruma, but not the sacrificial offerings. And so then the question is, when we see a priest eating teruma, is that good enough for us to say that's a priest and a priest of unflawed lineage, and therefore we can arrange a marriage for him based on the idea that he's a priest and he can marry only a woman who's qualified to marry a priest, and his children are considered priests qualified to serve in the temple? Can we assume that he has unflawed lineage or not? So what then is the meaning of great is the legal authority of presumptive status? What does that mean, the legal authority of presumptive status, and why do we say that it is great? So this is a standard case of presumptive status. As the practice of the priests remained as it was when they came from Babel up to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, and there's nothing novel in the application of the principle of presumptive status in this case that we were discussing yesterday. So the Gemara answers, initially in the Babylonian exile, they would partake of teruma taken from produce as obligated by rabbinic law. Now, upon their return to the land of Israel, they partake of teruma taken from produce as obligated by Torah law, right? So we sort of elevated the obligation itself. In Babylonia, it was done by rabbinic law. In the land of Israel, giving priests teruma is a Torah law. And if you wish, say instead, now too, upon their return to the land of Israel, the priests partake of teruma taken from produce obligated by rabbinic law, because at that point the temple was not standing when they returned. And so that was an interruption in the law as it was when the first temple was still standing. And kind of a continuous sequence from when Joshua led the children of Israel into Israel in that conquest, the initial conquest of the land of Israel, at God's behest. They didn't have the temple, but they had the Mishkan. They had the tabernacle that they brought with them out of the desert, and all the religious observance was built around, centered on the tabernacle, eventually replaced by the temple, as sort of arranged by King David and built by King Solomon. But then we had the interruption after the first temple was destroyed. So when they returned, were the priests receiving teruma by Torah law or by rabbinic law? However, of teruma taken from produce obligated by Torah. And if you wish, say instead, now too, upon their return to Israel, they partake of teruma taken from produce obligated by rabbinic law. However, of teruma taken from produce obligated by Torah law, they may not partake. Right, these priests who returned from Babylonia, and there was a little bit of uncertainty about whether they were priests or not. Perhaps the way they broke it down is, okay, if they're eating teruma by rabbinic law, we're a little bit more lenient, they can keep doing that. But now that they've returned to Israel, and are we going to allow them to eat teruma when it's obligated by Torah law? Perhaps not. However, in the case of one who partakes of teruma by rabbinic law, we do not And when do we elevate from teruma to lineage? When do we say that we see a priest eating teruma, therefore we can assume that he's of unflawed lineage, and we can say that is a full-fledged priest, and we can arrange a marriage for him as if he's a full-fledged priest. And the evidence that we need for that is simply that it was eating teruma. So maybe if he's eating teruma by rabbinic law, we're not going to elevate him. But if he's eating teruma by Torah law, we are going to elevate him. That's a possible distinction that the Gemara is suggesting. And when we elevate from teruma into lineage, this is only with regard to one who partakes of teruma by Torah law. However, in the case of one who partakes of teruma by rabbinic law, we do not elevate him to priestly lineage. And the Gemara asks, and what then is the meaning of great is the legal authority of presumptive status? And the Gemara answers, it means that although there is reason to issue a decree, now that they're back in the land of Israel, prohibiting consumption of teruma by rabbinic law due to teruma that is forbidden by Torah law, we do not issue that decree. Why? Because great is the legal authority of presumptive status. These priests who have a presumptive status of priests, they kept that status when they left Israel. They went to Babel, and even though there was some confusion and assimilation, if a guy knows that his father told him, we are priests and we eat teruma, so he maintains that status. And when they return from Babylonia to Israel, they still have that status. That's what we mean by great is the legal authority of the presumptive status, and they can eat teruma even by Torah law. and we elevate them to a priest of unflawed lineage because of that status? Maybe. So the Gemara asks, and did they in fact not partake of teruma by Torah law? But isn't it written that they should not partake of the most sacred items, Kodesh HaKodashim? The most sacred means that they would eat parts of priestly offerings that were brought on the altar. Ezra 2:63, from which it may be inferred, it is of the most sacred items, i.e. offerings, the priestly portions of offerings brought on the altar, that they did not partake. But of teruma by Torah law, they did partake. Even if there was a little bit of uncertainty, it just meant they were excluded from eating the priestly portions of offerings brought on the altar, but they were not excluded from eating teruma, food consecrated to be given to the priest that can be eaten outside the temple. It's just the first tithe that's given to priests. So the Gemara answers that this is what the verse is saying. Neither did they partake of items called Kodesh, as it is written, and no common man may eat of Kodesh, Leviticus 22:10. And this is referring to teruma. Nor did those priests of uncertain lineage partake of items called Kodashim, as it is written, and if a priest's daughter be married to a common man, she shall not eat of terumat hakodashim. Leviticus 22:12. And the master said that this means of that which is set aside from the offerings, kodashim, to the priests, either loaves of the thanks offering from the breast and the shoulder, they may not partake. So according to neither explanation can any proof be cited from the Baraisa as to whether or not one elevates from teruma or from the priestly benediction that they stand in front of the congregation in the synagogue and bless the congregation. We don't have a proof that one who eats teruma or one who blesses the congregation, from when we see them do that we can therefore assume they have unflawed lineage. We don't have a proof yet that we elevate to lineage from eating teruma or blessing the congregation. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. Presumptive status for priesthood is established by the lifting of hands, meaning blessing the congregation, in Babylonia, by partaking of challah in Syria. Now, this is another thing that's done for priests, right? When we eat challah on Friday nights, on Shabbos, we eat challah, right? We call it challah, the nice egg bread. You should all be blessed someday to taste Nina's challah. It's amazing. We call that bread challah, but what challah actually means is that it's bread from which a piece was removed that's supposedly given to the priest. These days, we don't give it to the priest in the absence of the temple and of the tithing process. We also don't give challah to the priest. We just set it aside and burn it. But for it to be actual challah, we do have to remove a piece. And there's some requirements for that. You have to sort of make enough challah at a time. It's something like 5 pounds of flour. You have to make a big batch of challah. And from that, you remove some of the dough before you make your various loaves, and then it is actually challah. But the actual obligation of challah was to give some of your dough when you make bread, give some to a Kohen, give some to a priest. So here they're saying the presumptive status for priesthood is established by lifting the hands in Babylonia. So Jews in Babylonia, that just meant outside of Israel, basically, who blessed the congregation. That's a Kohen. Now we know he's a Kohen. Or by partaking of challah in Syria. They received challah from their neighbors who were taking, the women where they were making challah. They set out a piece for the priest and they gave it to this particular guy. That proves he's a priest. And by distributing priestly gifts, meaning the portions received in the temple that are distributed to the priests. The foreleg, the jaw, and the maw of certain offerings, if it was given to a person, it must be because he's a priest in the cities. So in any event, the Tana of this Baraisa is teaching that the lifting of hands establishes the presumptive status of priesthood. And the Gemara asks, what, does it not establish a presumptive status for lineage? And the Gemara answers, no, it establishes a presumptive status for teruma. If we see a priest lift his hands and bless the congregation, we can assume he's a priest for the purpose of allowing him to receive teruma. But it doesn't mean that we've established him as one of unflawed lineage as a priest who can be married as such. So the Gemara asks, but isn't lifting of hands taught parallel to partaking of challah. And just as with regard to partaking of challah, the Tana teaches us that it establishes presumptive status for lineage, so too with regard to lifting the hands, the Tana, this rabbi of the Mishnah, is teaching us that it establishes presumptive status for lineage. And the Gemara answers, no, partaking of challah itself establishes presumptive status only for teruma, not for lineage. And this Tana holds that today, so today, what does today mean? Today, at the time of the Gemara, so about 1,500 years ago, the Tana holds that today the obligation to separate challah from dough is by rabbinic law, and the obligation to separate teruma is still by Torah law. And the Tana teaches that we elevate from challah, which is an obligation by rabbinic law, to teruma, which is by Torah law. And this explanation is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, cited below, who reversed the opinion of the rabbis and posited that challah today, 1,500 years ago, is an obligation by rabbinic law. So the Gemara suggests, come in here proof from a Baraisa. Presumptive status for priesthood is established in the land of Israel by the lifting of hands to bless the congregation and distribution of teruma at the threshing floors. Right? So it wasn't always, you didn't necessarily have a friend or a neighbor who was a priest, and when you were gathering your produce from the field and you needed to tithe it so that you could go ahead and eat it, so you had to take the first 2% and give it to a priest, but maybe you didn't know a priest. So they had a collection area, kind of like a tax collector in a sense, but it was a tithe collection point where people would deposit their teruma, and then priests could come to that place and receive teruma, and so could their families. And so if you saw somebody receiving teruma from the teruma distribution center, you could say that person is a priest, right? So presumptive status for priesthood established in the land of Israel by the lifting of hands and distribution of teruma at the threshing floors. And in Syria and in every place outside the land of Israel, that emissaries informing residents of the diaspora of sanctification of the new moon arrive. Right? In the old days, before the calendar was set for all time, a new month would only begin when witnesses testified in Jerusalem that they had seen the new moon. The Sanhedrin says, we've established that the new month has begun, and then they sent out messengers out into the diaspora, and it would sometimes take days or weeks before they would hear that the new month had begun. But in all those outlying regions, what do we learn? And in every place outside Israel where the emissaries come to announce the new moon, the lifting of hands constitutes proof of the presumptive status for priesthood, as the court would investigate the lineage of everyone who recited the priestly benediction. It's not just that because you say you're a priest, they let you bless the congregation. The court would investigate the people who say they're priests and make sure they're priests, and then they would be allowed to bless the congregation. But distribution of teruma at the threshing floors does not constitute proof of that status. Since there is no obligation of teruma by Torah law, the courts were not as resolute in examining the lineage of those to whom teruma was distributed. It was a lower standard of proof. Just somebody who showed up and probably said, I'm a priest, they gave him teruma. So because it wasn't investigated, you couldn't have the same certainty that that person really is a priest, like outside of Israel, where they would have people bless the congregation because the local court, their local rabbinic court, would investigate these people and make sure that they are priests. And by the way, what is the law today? When we don't have teruma and we don't sanctify the moon, and we certainly don't bring offerings because there is no temple, there are no priestly portions being distributed. So the main thing that priests do is bless the congregation and take the first aliyah when there's Torah reading in synagogue. They also have their own obligations not to enter a cemetery except for a very close relative, etc. Or they might be asked to lead the grace after meals because they're a Kohen. But in all these things, if a person says he's a Kohen, he is believed. We don't investigate Kohanim. We assume that if they're saying they're Kohen, it's because they heard that from their father, who heard it from his father, who heard it from his father, and they are believed. That's how it is today. but not exactly how it was 1,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And the status in Babylonia is like that in Syria, as there too, there are permanent courts that examine the lineage of those reciting the priestly benediction in front of the congregation. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says even Alexandria of Egypt initially had the same status as Syria due to the fact that there was a permanent court there, ensuring that the lifting of hands was performed only by a priest. In any event, the Tana of the Bryce under discussion teaches that the lifting of hands establishes the presumptive status of priesthood. So the Gemara asks, what? Does it not establish presumptive status for lineage? So if you're saying that a court investigated these priests to make sure they're really priests before they're allowed to lift their hands, then you would think that lifting the hands in those communities would establish lineage. And so the Gemara answers, no, the lifting of hands establishes presumptive status for challah. The Gemara asks, but isn't the law of lifting of hands taught parallel to the law of the distribution of teruma at the threshing floors? And just as the distribution of teruma at the threshing floors in the land of Israel establishes presumptive status for lineage, so too the lifting of hands establishes presumptive status for lineage. The Gemara answers, no. Distribution of teruma at the threshing floors establishes presumptive status only for challah, but not for lineage. And the Tana holds that today, 1,500 years ago, the obligation to separate teruma is by rabbinic law and challah is by Torah law. And so the Tana teaches that we elevate from teruma, which is an obligation by rabbinic law, to challah, which is by Torah law, but we haven't established whether we elevate to lineage. And the dispute with regard to the legal status of teruma and challah today is as in the incident where Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua, found that this is the opinion of the rabbis. As Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, I found the sages in the study hall of Rav who were sitting and saying, even according to the one who said that teruma today is an obligation by rabbinic law, the obligation to separate challah is by Torah law, as during the 7 years that the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan, led by Joshua, and during the 7 years that they divided the land, they were obligated in challah, but were not obligated in teruma. So today too, although there is no obligation to take teruma in Eretz Yisrael by Torah law, the obligation to separate challah is by Torah law. And I said to them, on the contrary, even according to the one who said that teruma today is an obligation by Torah law, the obligation to separate challah is by rabbinic law, as it is taught in a baraisa with regard to the verse concerning challah, when you come into the land. From the first of your dough, you should separate teruma. Numbers 15, 18 through 19. If the obligation is when you come to the land, one might have thought that it took effect from the moment that the 2 or 3 spies entered the land. Therefore, the verse states, when you come, from which it is derived that God is saying, I said that the obligation takes effect with the coming of all of you and not with the coming of some of you. So separating challah is an obligation by Torah law only when the entire Jewish people comes to the land of Israel. And when Ezra took them up to the land of Israel at the beginning of the Second Temple period, not all of them ascended. Since the majority of the people did not come to the land but remained in Babylonia, separating challah was not restored to the status of an obligation by Torah law, but they continued observing it by rabbinic law, right? So they were able to interpret from the written Torah that separating challah, giving that portion to the priest, is an obligation by Torah law only when the whole Jewish people is living in the land of Israel. If that is not so, we still do it, when the temple is standing, but it's by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. Today we separate challah, but we don't give it to a priest. So the Gemara cites proof from another baraisa to resolve the dilemma. Come in here, and now we're on 25b. The presumptive status for priesthood is established by lifting of the hands for the priestly benediction, and by distribution of teruma at the threshing floors, and by testimony. We haven't talked about testimony in a while. What does that mean? That witnesses come and say, this man is a priest, and we know he is. So the Gemara asks, does testimony merely establish presumptive status? Testimony provides absolute proof of his status, not merely a presumption. Rather, is it not, that this is what the Tana is saying? Lifting of the hands is like testimony. Just as testimony that one is a priest elevates him to the priesthood for lineage, so too, lifting of the hands establishes presumptive status for lineage. And the Gemara answers, no. When the Tan is referring to testimony, he is stating that the legal status of testimony that is based on presumptive status is like that of presumptive status itself. As in the incident involving a certain man who came before Rabbi Ami and said to him, that man established presumptive status before me that he is a priest. And Rabbi Ami said to him, what did you see that led you to that conclusion? And he said to Rabbi Ami, I saw that he was called to the Torah and he read first in the synagogue. So Rabbi Ami asked him, did he read first based on the presumptive status that he is a priest, or was it based on the presumptive status that he is a great man? The custom was that a priest would be called to the Torah first, unless there was a prominent Torah scholar among the worshipers. And he said to Rabbi Ami, he read the Torah as a priest, as after him a Levite read the Torah. And a Levite is called to the Torah second only when a priest is called first. And Rabbi Ami elevated him to the priesthood on the basis of his statement. And by the way, even today, if there's a Kohen in the synagogue at the time of Torah reading, he's called first. Even if there are great people in the congregation, if there's a Kohen there, we call the Kohen first. If there's a Levite there, and there was a Kohen, so the Levite is called after the Kohen. If there's no Kohen, you can call the Levite first, but you don't have to. The Gemara relates an incident involving a certain man who came before Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And after him a Levite read the Torah. And a Levite is called to the Torah second only when a priest is called first. And Rabbi Ami elevated him to the priesthood on the basis of his statement. And the Gemara relates an incident involving a certain man who came before Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And he said to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, that man established the presumptive status before me that he is a Levite. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said to him, what did you see that led you to conclude that he is a Levite? And he said to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, I saw that he was called to the Torah and that he read second in the synagogue. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked him, did he read second based on the presumptive status that he is a Levite, or was it based on the presumptive status that he is a great man? When there is no priest in the synagogue, people in the synagogue are called to the Torah in order of their prominence. Perhaps he was the second most prominent man in the synagogue. And he said to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, I am certain that he is a Levite, as a priest read the Torah before him. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi elevated him to Levite status based on his statement. So the Gemara relates another incident involving a certain man who came before Reish Lakish and said to Reish Lakish, that man established a presumptive status before me that he is a priest, a Kohen. So Reish Lakish said to him, what did you see that led you to that conclusion? He said to Reish Lakish, I saw that he was called to the Torah and read first in the synagogue. And Reish Lakish, based on his opinion that one's presumptive status as a priest can be established only on the basis of his receiving teruma, said to him, right, follow-up question, did you see that he received a share of teruma at the threshing floor? And Rabbi Elazar said to Reish Lakish, and if there is no threshing floor there, does the priesthood cease to exist? The testimony that he read from the Torah first is sufficient. And on another occasion, Rabbi Elazar and Reish Lakish sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and a matter similar to that incident where one testified that another is a priest based on his reading the Torah first came before Rabbi Yochanan. And Reish Lakish said to the person who testified, did you see that he received a share of teruma at the threshing floor? And Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, and if there is no threshing floor there, does the priesthood cease to exist? The Gemara relates that Reish Lakish turned and looked at Rabbi Elazar harshly, as he understood that on the previous occasion, Rabbi Elazar was citing verbatim a ruling that he had heard from Rabbi Yochanan, but didn't tell Reish Lakish. Rabbi Elazar didn't say to Reish Lakish, and you don't need to see him receive teruma at the threshing floor. If you see him read first in the synagogue, that's enough to establish him as a priest. And I know that because I heard it from Rabbi Yochanan. But Rabbi Elazar didn't tell Reish Lakish when they had this conversation that he had heard that teaching from Rabbi Yochanan. And it's very relevant because Rabbi Yochanan is Reish Lakish's teacher, mentor, friend, colleague. And if Reish Lakish had known that the teaching came from Rabbi Yochanan, he would have believed it right away. So he believed it from Rabbi Elazar, but it's an important thing. And you see how often a teaching is brought down in the name of somebody who said it in the name of somebody who said it in the name of somebody, that you have to give teachings in the name of the person that you heard it from. So Reish Lakish was angry at Rabbi Elazar for not giving that teaching over in the name of Reish Lakish's own teacher, Rabbi Yochanan. So Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Elazar, you heard a statement of Bar Napacha, the son of a blacksmith, which was an epithet for Rabbi Yochanan, and you did not say it to us in his name? Had you done so, I would have accepted it from you then. And so the Gemara relates with regard to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, who edited the Mishnah, and Rabbi Chia, that one elevated a son to priesthood on the basis of the statement of his father, and one elevated a brother to the Levite status on the basis of the statement of his brother. And it is unclear which of the sages ruled in which case. But at any rate, if a man says, according to this, well, I'm a priest and this is my son and he's a priest, so we believe that, and now we elevate the son to the status of priest in all matters, right, of unflawed lineage. And the Gemara notes, it may be concluded that Rebbe is the one who elevated a son to the priesthood on the basis of the statement of his father, as it is taught in a Baraisa that if one came and said, this is my son, and he is a priest, his statement is deemed credible to enable his son to partake of teruma. But it is not deemed credible to marry a woman of superior lineage to him, as his testimony is not deemed credible for the purposes of lineage, and this is the statement of Rebbe. Why would you believe the father to say that his son is a priest in order to enable him to eat teruma, but you wouldn't believe him to enable the son to be, assumed to be one of unflawed lineage and therefore fit to marry a woman of superior lineage? And the answer is because the father would be biased, right? I mean, you'd want other witnesses to do that. You want at least two witnesses to establish this. The father can inform us that he's a priest, and maybe we've already accepted that, and that this is his son, and therefore we're going to accept that the son can eat teruma, but are we sure that he's unflawed lineage? Maybe not. Maybe this father was unflawed lineage, but he happened to father this son by a woman who was unfit for him to marry. Maybe he married a divorced woman, which a priest is not allowed to do. So Rabbi Chia said to him, if you deem the father credible to enable his son to partake of teruma, so deem him credible to marry a woman to his son. And if you do not deem him credible to marry a woman to him, then you should not deem him credible to enable his son to partake of teruma. And so Rebbe answered, and we're almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. So Rebbe answered, I deem him credible to enable his son to partake of teruma, as it is within his purview to feed his son teruma. If you are a priest, then you can give teruma to your household, right? A regular Israel, a regular Jew cannot eat teruma, but a priest can eat teruma, his wife can eat teruma, his children can eat teruma, and actually his slaves can eat teruma because they're all members of his household. So to say that my son, he's my son, he can eat teruma, this is within the purview of a father who is a priest. So Rebbe accepts that. But I do not deem him credible to marry a woman to his son, as it is not within his purview to marry a woman to his son, and therefore his testimony is not accepted. And the Gemara determines, indeed, it may be concluded that it is Rebbe who elevated a man to priesthood on the basis of the statement of his father. And from the fact that it is Rebbe who elevated a son to priesthood on the basis of the statement of his father, clearly it is Rabbi Chia who elevated a brother to Levite status on the basis of the statement of his brother. Rebbe does elevate, at least to the point of eating teruma, if not lineage. So the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Chia, what is different in the case of a son where a father is not deemed credible because the son is a relative of his father, and therefore the father is disqualified from testifying about his son? Is that the reason? But a brother is also a relative of his brother, and therefore the brother should have been disqualified from testifying about his brother. And Rabbi Chia should accept the testimony in both cases or reject the testimony in both cases. Now we're on 26a, and the Gemara answers, Rabbi Chia is speaking of a case where the brother speaks offhandedly in the context of a conversation about a different topic. It was understood from this that his brother is a Levite, And this is similar to that which Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said. There was an incident involving a person who was speaking offhandedly and said, I remember when I was a child and still young enough to be carried on my father's shoulder, and they took me out of school and removed my cloak and immersed me to purify me from any possible ritual impurity so that I should be able to eat of teruma. That evening, he wasn't giving testimony to establish himself as a priest, but from the fact that he spoke in this offhanded manner about his memory, somebody could witness that and testify that this person is a priest. And Rabbi Chia, who related that incident, concluded the story and related that the man said, and my friends distanced themselves from me and would call me Yochanan, who partakes of chalot, as it was prohibited for his friends, who were non-priests, to eat challah and teruma. And Rebbe elevated him to priesthood based on his statement. So just as one's offhanded statement is reliable, so too is the offhanded statement of one's brother. It's not like testimony, which you cannot do on behalf of a relative, as we learned there. All right, let's see if there are any questions or comments on page 25. Bill. So, kahuna, in the sense of big kahuna, is actually a native Hawaiian word for king, nobleman, or priest. But as we know, there are no coincidences, so who knows what God may have arranged behind the scenes of history to arrange that synchronicity. Right, I'm sure that the term big kahuna, like when the Flintstones use it or whatever, is much more closely tied to Hawaiian traditions. But it's interesting that the word kahuna in Hebrew refers to the priesthood. Lucy, I seem to remember that the son of a priest and a widow, raped woman, etc., is a priest because of paternal lineage. He can eat teruma, but not sacrificial meat, and he cannot serve in the temple. I suppose he cannot bless either. Do I have this right? For sure, he can eat teruma, but not sacrificial meat, and he cannot serve in the temple. Can he bless? I think probably in old times he could not bless the congregation. Right, that's why they talked about that they would have a court, investigate his lineage, even for blessing the congregation outside of the land of Israel. But today, probably all priests are assumed to be a flawed lineage. Because we don't know what's happened over the centuries. But anyone who is a priest is fit to bless the congregation. And to receive the first aliyah. If you were told by your father you're a Kohen, we don't ask, were you a qualified Kohen? Did your father marry, divorcee, etc.? I mean, I'm not sure about that. I think the bottom line is if somebody comes and says, I'm a Kohen, my father was a Kohen, we don't, in the synagogue, ask him whether, his mom was a divorcee when, she married his father. We don't ask, and he's allowed to bless. But if somebody asks for a ruling, hey, my father was a Kohen, but there were these issues in my family, am I fit to bless the congregation or not? It might be a more complicated answer. I don't know the answer. It's just one to ask a rabbi. Tom, if you said you're a Kohen, but there's a question of your lineage, presumptively you can partake of teruma. What about serving in the temple? What about your sons or your son's status? Right, so when the temple is standing, and what's going to happen when the third temple is built, I don't know. But let's just go back in time. So when the second temple was still standing, if there was any kind of question of lineage, so no, right? So that would be a halal, right? If he was the son of a priest, or his mother committed adultery and he's a mamzer, or he's the son of a priest who married a divorced woman who was not fit for him. In those cases, he might be a priest, he might be fit to eat teruma, but he cannot serve in the temple for sure. So that's what we've got today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a terrific